Gway. Hello, everyone. My name is Carla Mitchell, and I'm the Systems Supervisor. I'm really pleased to welcome you all virtually today in all of our work sites, our offices, and of course, our schools. I'd like to acknowledge first and foremost that we're in Mi'kma'ki, the unceded and ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. So welcome to you all. We have another exceptional and critical opportunity across our divisions today to learn together professionally and collaboratively during today's session, which is about land acknowledgements. For those of you who were able to join us yesterday for Glenn Thompson's session on how to be an ally, you will immediately see connections during today's session. We will also have an opportunity today to practice our allyship skills in the focus areas of listen and learn. If you remember the acronym from yesterday in ally, one of the L's was listen and learn. So we'll be able to practice just that today. As I mentioned, the session today is about land acknowledgements. There'll be a focus on why they are so important to each one of us, but also there'll be an opportunity for discussion in terms of our shared history, because we are all treaty people. At this point, I'm really pleased to introduce our session presenters for today for the next hour. And with us, we have Melody Martin-Gugu, who is the coordinator of Mi'kmaq Education Services. And we're also pleased to have Emily Riley, who is the Regional Equity Consultant. Again, thank you, all of you, for coming together to join us today virtually. And please enjoy this opportunity, everyone. Thank you.
Gwe, Deloisi Melody Martin-Gugu, Dlewi Millbrook, Winnebexi Mi'kma'ki. Hello, my name is Melody Martin-Gugu, and I live in Millbrook, and I'm from Sibignegarig, which is actually one of the 7 districts in Mi'kma'ki. Our elder in Giju, Patsy Paul Martin, could not be here today, and so I want to honor her by acknowledging her. And I know that she's relaxing at home with her cup of Bidaway, and she's wishing us well.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emily Riley, and I'm the Regional Student Equity Consultant for CCRCE. I'm really excited to participate in this with Melody and with Patsy at a distance. As a brief introduction to my role, the way that I describe myself to students is that I'm a professional ally. So not that I'm a professional like I'm perfect, but I'm a professional as in I'm pretty comfortable in professional spaces. So the role that I play is to help students understand what being an ally looks like and to act as an ally for students who need it.
So as Mi'kmaq, we love to gather, but when we do, we always respect our elders and we respect the gift of gathering. So we honor the ability to listen and to collaborate. And so traditionally, I would have asked our elder, Patsy, to thank the Creator, using the language our ancestors passed on to my people. Our language is sacred. It holds knowledge and teachings. And we honor each other with the sacred medicines lent to us by Gisulk, our Creator. Sage, sweetgrass, cedar, tobacco. The image that I included in our slide includes deer hoof fungi, sweetgrass, and a young eagle feather. These were gifts given to me by my firstborn son. And you'll notice that the medicines are also wrapped in a red fabric. Red is used because it is viewed as a protective color, because my medicines were prayed for in ceremony, and they were wrapped in protection so that my prayers would be strong when used. We want to start our session today in a good way, with a good mindset, with a good heart, and with good intentions. So usually our elder would pray in Mi'kmaq, so I'm going to honor my ancestors by speaking my language. Walali Gisulk, Uchtidim Sitgo, Don Deli Ignumwek, Desi Bunkek. Walali Naguset, Achwalali Lohantiej, Don Deli Ignumwek Waso. Walali Uxit. Don Deli Ignamueg Mujib Joel. Walali Kisuk Don Deli Ignamueg Mujib Joel, Ach Gijinen, Ach Nukjinen, Ach Don Deli Salsulieg, Ach Don Deli Ankwe Wuxieg. Walalieg Ukjit Kisuk, Don Deli Ignamueg Desi Bunkek. Walalieg.
So for our housekeeping, we have a few items here for you. The first says we're here to challenge ourselves and to reflect on our own system. Today's session will focus on the L for learning. Our own experience is valid, but it may not be universal. And we have the right to our opinions. However, our opinions may not be based on fact. In yesterday's presentation by Glenn Thompson on how to be an ally, one of the characteristics he described as being a really important characteristic of an ally is learning. Today's session will briefly combine hundreds of years of history with a Mi'kmaq perspective on how that history has been taught in our schools. This is a great opportunity for everyone in our school system to learn more about our shared history and to see a path forward towards reconciliation.
So I'm going to begin our session with the sharing of 3 different versions of a land acknowledgement. So as we read each variation, I want to prompt you to think about this question while you listen. What do you think of when you hear a land acknowledgement? What resonates with you as you read these words? So I want you to reflect on that. In version 1, we acknowledge that we are in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people.
In version 2, this is a common version that you might hear around the province of Nova Scotia. It says, this morning we would like to acknowledge Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral homeland of the Mi'kmaq, whose traditional territory we are gathering on today.
In version 3, we acknowledge our session today on the unceded and traditional homeland of my ancestors, the Mi'kmaq. Land acknowledgement and recognition of the ancestors whose homeland we live upon is an important part of the reconciliation process. So in order for this session to take place, for Canadians to enjoy the lives that they have, Indigenous peoples were removed, they were displaced, and they were even killed. This truth is uncomfortable, but it's one that's necessary to face if we as fellow Canadians are to understand our whole history. We honor my ancestors, the Mi'kmaq, whose stories have been shaped by the traditional territories of Mi'kma'ki.
So there's going to be an opportunity for you to turn and talk with your hopefully socially distanced shoulder partner at the moment. Share your thoughts about the question we asked, which is, what do you think of when you hear a land acknowledgement? Please notice that we did not ask you what you think about a land acknowledgement. We ask what you think about when you hear the land acknowledgement. We will give you 2 minutes to turn and talk, and then we'll continue with our presentation.
Didn't move. So, what is a land acknowledgement? A land acknowledgement is recognition of the traditional territory of the Indigenous people of this land. So in Nova Scotia, it's the Mi'kmaq. The Mi'kmaq are the Indigenous people of Mi'kma'ki. Mi'kma'ki includes all of present-day Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, central and eastern New Brunswick, the Gaspé Peninsula, and Newfoundland. So it's important to note that today, the United States border separates us from our traditional homelands in Maine and in the New England states. A land acknowledgement can be verbal, it can be signage, it can be brief, it can be detailed, but it acknowledges the inherent right to the land. It commemorates the Indigenous people's deep connection to land because our ways of being is rooted in the relationship our people had with the land. For thousands of years, our people maintained sophisticated knowledge about our world, its animals, its plants, seasons, landscapes, and the seascapes of Mi'kma'ki. So when a land acknowledgement is done, it honors this legacy. Canada prides itself as a country that is built on the foundation of democracy, peace, and kindness. A country that holds respect for all nations. But as Mi'kmaq, we know different. As a Mi'kmaq woman, I stand here and I honor the stories of my ancestors. Ancestors who lived in Mi'kma'ki for over 13,000 years. Ancestors who have lived with a strong connection to plants, animals, and the land that are native to Mi'kma'ki. They all held on to deep and established ways of government, community, spirituality, and ways of thinking. So Canada was born in 1867. Not long after, Canada's Indigenous policy was born. So for many years, our country's goal was to eliminate Indigenous governments, remove Indigenous people from their lands, ignore sacred treaties and Indigenous rights. And for many years, my people experienced cultural genocide. Sacred lands were seized. Movements was restricted. We were put on reserves. We were given government-funded babysitters in the form of Indian agents. We were told when and how we could leave the confinements of a reserve. We couldn't vote. We couldn't get an education. We couldn't travel. We weren't Canadian citizens. Our languages were banned and our spiritual practices were forbidden. So land acknowledgements is a necessary first step towards honoring the original inhabitants of this land. So through land acknowledgements, we are recognizing the beliefs, the traditions, and the language of the Indigenous people of this land, all of which have been restricted for far too long. Land acknowledgement is a recognition of the attempted genocide of the first peoples of this land, including my people, the Mi'kmaq. Land acknowledgement provides a solid framework for reconciliation, acknowledging the injustices that have been carried out against Indigenous communities. My ancestors and my people are incredibly resilient. We have survived years of displacement from sacred lands. Our way of life was once closely connected to the earth, the water, the sky, and stars. This way of life was disrupted with the colonization of our lands and ways of being and knowing. We've been fighting for justice and equity since then. From negotiating treaties to advocating for recognition of treaty rights, we've never been silent. Over the past years, Indigenous calls to share truths in our shared history have brought many issues to light. Stories from survivors of residential schools, intentional breakup of Indigenous families through the 60s scoop, the devastating statistics of the Indigenous and realities of missing and murdered Indigenous women and men, elders fighting fiercely to protect our sacred waters, and the struggle to declare that Indigenous issues are not just Indigenous issues, but Canadian issues. So when a land acknowledgement is done, it brings truth to this legacy.
Like Melody just mentioned, the Indigenous peoples of Canada are incredibly resilient. But part of being an ally is to listen to the stories and to learn the truth about Canada's history, causing the Indigenous people to need to be resilient in the first place. It is very important to understand that colonization isn't just a Mi'kmaq or Indigenous problem. Generations of Canadians have been affected, and we as individuals are included in that mix. Remember, acknowledgement is not about blame, it's about reconciliation. So yesterday in the session with Glenn Thompson about how to be an ally, he asked you what steps you might take to be a treaty education ally. I imagine a lot of you said that you wanted to learn more about the Mi'kmaq and other Indigenous peoples, and possibly more about their history, the treaties, their relationships with the government, that kind of idea. As part of that step, look at this list. Turn to your socially distant shoulder partner and share what events on this list you have learned about or know about, and what events you would like to learn more about. So on this list include a number of events: broken treaty relationships, dispossession, the disconnection to land, the Indian Act, centralization, specifically in Mi'kma'ki, the creation of reserves, residential schools, the 60s scoop, and assimilation, including the loss of language, connection to culture, and elders. So turn and talk to your shoulder partner. What of those things do you already know, and what do you want to learn more about? When Melody comes back on the screen in 2 minutes, we'll continue.
I quote the Deputy of Indian Affairs, the supposedly honorable Duncan Campbell Scott in 1920, quote, "Our object is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada," unquote. The first Indian residential school was established in 1874, long before Duncan Campbell Scott made his hateful declaration in the House of Commons. For over 100 years, Canada continued to implement its policy of assimilating the Indigenous peoples of Canada with the establishment of over 100 residential schools. Over 150,000 Indigenous children were sent to these institutions. Some children were as young as 4 years old. These schools were not filled with the loving teachers our students embrace today. No, these schools were institutions of abuse. Indian residential schools were lonely, they were alien, they were poorly built, they were poorly insulated, they were poorly maintained, staff was poorly trained, diet was meager, daily life was regimented, educational opportunities were non-existent, language and culture were denied, families were torn apart. This was a part of Canada's history that is largely unknown.
Atlantic Canada operated its own residential school in Shubenacadie from about 1930 until 1967. Indigenous children from as far away as New Brunswick and Cape Breton, as well as all of the children in this area, were coerced or taken away from their families to attend the Shubenacadie residential school. This picture on this slide is the front cover of Isabel Knockwood's book, Out of the Depths, which tells of the horrific experiences of the children who attended this school. Isabel is from Mi'kma'ki, and she herself attended this school. Well, this school closed in 1967. The last residential school in Canada did not close until 1996. Orange Shirt Day, which is on September 30th, commemorates the resilience of residential school survivors and their families. Wearing orange on this day is a respectful way for an ally to honor the Indigenous residential school students, both those that survived and those that did not.
So the Mi'kmaq welcomed newcomers to this land with the intention to share resources in a manner that would benefit everyone. This was the intent of treaty negotiations. So this was the intent of our first treaty that was ratified in 1728. So it was the intent of the renegotiations in the following treaties in 1749, 1752, 1760, 1762, 1763, 1776, and 1778. Unfortunately, the government of Nova Scotia had other things in mind. So when a land acknowledgement is done, it honors this legacy.
So the word cede, which you may know from the land acknowledgements, the word cede itself means to give up. So if you cede your land or you cede your land rights, it means that you give up your rights to the land and any of its resources. When the Mi'kmaq signed treaties with the British in the 1700s, all of those treaties that Melody just listed, the reason they signed them was to allow the British to have land rights. So the Mi'kmaq never ceded their rights to Mi'kma'ki. They simply agreed to share the land and the resources with the British. But the word unceded is the word that actually shows up in the land acknowledgement itself. And it is a really important word to use in a land acknowledgement. As the Mi'kmaq have been saying for generations, and as the Canadian government finally agreed in 1989, these treaties are still valid. They are legal documents. And so Mi'kma'ki remains unceded. This is very rare. In fact, there are only 2 places in all of Canada that have officially recognized unceded land, Mi'kma'ki and some parts of northern British Columbia. That's it. Being unceded means Mi'kma'ki and its resources are still meant to be shared and protected by anyone who lives here. It's important to recognize this fact as it's very uncommon, and it requires institutions like education to make extra efforts to live by the intent of the treaties. We share this land, we share its resources, and we have a responsibility to ensure all future generations have the opportunity to continue this relationship with each other and with the land.
So with great courage, bravery, and support, our residential school survivors began to step forward and share their experiences. The stories of these survivors was a lot different than the stories Canada had been telling over the years. These stories of truth resulted in the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on June 2nd, 2008. For over 6 years, the TRC traveled throughout Canada, listening to the stories of survivors and documenting the truth. The goal of the TRC is just that, to face the truth of Canada's role in the cultural genocide of my people and the Indigenous peoples in Canada. For years, non-Indigenous people were told that the lives of Indigenous people were not good, that their languages and cultures were irrelevant, that they were heathens, pagans, and uncivilized. Many generations of people were raised into thinking the wrong way, a negative way, and we need to change that. Reconciliation isn't about blaming, it's about getting to the truth. So with great courage, bravery, and support, our residential school survivors began to step forward and share their experiences. The stories of survivors was a lot different than the stories Canada had been telling over the years. And these stories of truth resulted in the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission on June 2nd, 2008. Land acknowledgements contradict what we have been taught about our Canadian and Atlantic Canadian identities. Remember that knowing and proving identity is what many of our Mi'kmaq and Indigenous students face every day. So remember that land acknowledgements, they can be very brief, they can be a bit more in depth, and sometimes they can even be ceremonial, including an elder or a knowledge keeper and a smudge. But always be mindful of the thoughts that are going through your head. Take some time to reflect and to dig deep into some personal biases that you may have and ask yourself the question, do they contribute to discrimination? Be honest with yourself, with your peers, with your own children. So think back to that second version that I shared with you at the beginning of the session, rather the third one. Some of you may have been even uncomfortable acknowledging the fact that Mi'kmaq people have been killed on this land. But these are harsh truths about our past, and many of those truths are still happening today. Indigenous peoples experience many of these difficult truths that are still carried out by the institutions that we believe in.
So the goal of this presentation is not to make you feel guilty. We are all on a journey, and learning together is a great step towards reconciliation. Our shared history is just that. It's all of ours and it's shared. So learning about this shared history lets all of us hold ourselves accountable to the role of being a good ally.
So is there a wrong way to do a land acknowledgement? Well, if your land acknowledgement is dry and if it's scripted or it's not even connected to the Indigenous people and territory that you are in, then you are doing it wrong. Don't just simply check off a box and get on with your day. Invest in learning some more about the Indigenous people of the land that you live on. So in our case, it's the Mi'kmaq within Mi'kma'ki. So be authentic. Ask yourself, why am I doing this? Do I show humility? Do I provide learning opportunities that connect to land acknowledgement? Do I include Mi'kmaq voice? Am I being collaborative?
Hello. Oh. Hello. First, I'd like to remind everyone here to turn off your cell phones. Before we begin this evening's performance, we would like to acknowledge that this theater stands on territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Petun First Nations. We are also mindful of broken covenants and the need to make right with all our relations. And now, please enjoy the show.
Oh, sorry, hello. Sorry, excuse me. Should we go?
Excuse me?
Oh, no, I just mean if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we leave?
Oh, no. The theater is here now. We'd just like to acknowledge whose land it is.
I'm sorry, I'm so confused. So if we're on someone else's land, shouldn't we do something about that, or?
Hopefully we'll enjoy the performance.
Oh, okay, so some of the money from the ticket sales of the show are going to the Indigenous communities?
Well, no.
Oh, a portion of them?
No, the ticket sales go to the theater.
So is the money from the bottled water sold here going to the First Nations for clean drinking water, or?
Oh no, that money goes to Nestle.
Nestle.
They're a sponsor.
I'm so sorry. I'm so confused. So whose land are we on? What are we doing?
It's a dialogue.
How are we making right?
Well, there's a plaque you can read in the lobby.
I don't understand.
I'm getting a message from the stage manager that we need to begin the show, so please take your seats.
But
Have a good time.
Good
night.
guess I'll sit down. Enjoy the show. Just enjoy the show.
If you ever want to know how not to do a land acknowledgement, they hit it right on the head. So what else do you need to know? So the first thing that we have listed here is that the Mi'kmaq and other Indigenous people are still healing. So the idea of just get over it, or it happened so long ago, why do you still care? This is very, very now and very current. So people are still healing. Each Indigenous person is different. They have different learning experiences, different life experiences, different life journeys. So what's true for one Indigenous person may not be true for all. Remember the importance of the relationship to the land as opposed to the idea of owning the land. Owning the land is a very different idea of the kind of relationship we have. It's not about what the land we can take from the land, it's what we can give the land and what the land can give back to us. And remember the strength and resilience of Indigenous people after all these years of colonization. As we mentioned previously, a land acknowledgement is one of the first steps towards reconciliation, but I emphasize first steps because we all have a responsibility to be an ally and to move forward with reconciliation. We don't want the land acknowledgement to be meaningless repetition, so that you're not just saying it for the sake of checking that checkbox, because establishing a practice of using a land acknowledgement as a real acknowledgement, not just a tick box, but as something you can actually understand and engage with in our schools, is a great step towards creating a generation of students who have better relationships with the Mi'kmaq and in Mi'kmaqi.
We need to restore and repair the relationship that Indigenous people have had with Canada. There has to be an awareness of the past, and there has to be an acknowledgement of the harm that has been inflicted into the minds of both Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. We need to heal, but healing cannot happen alone. It begins with the individual. It begins with you, regardless of your role at CCRCE, whether you are a custodian, administrative assistant, or handling IT. All of us have a role to play. And this history doesn't just belong to me as a Mi'kmaq woman. It belongs to all of us. Reconciliation won't be easy and it won't be quick. Healing takes time, but discovering the truth and making amends with the truth is the goal of reconciliation. And we will all be stronger because of it. Msit Nogama. I just want to remind you all that the recording will be shared, and so will the presentation file. And also the link to the video has been added to the Q&A, and it'll also be shared tomorrow. So as the webinar ends, you're going to have 2 brief feedback questions will appear on the screen for the group to answer together. Thanks.
Thank you.